The winds of March 1945 blew across Slovakia, carrying the scent of thawing mud and the acrid, metallic taste of a war that was finally collapsing in on itself. Irena Kawaschová, heavy with child and exhausted, stood amidst the chaos of a world in transition. She was 6 months pregnant, her body swollen and aching, yet a frantic energy propelled her forward. She had been staying in the safety of her native village, Teplichka nad Váhom, in the western rolling hills of the country, but news had arrived that shattered her temporary peace. Her firstborn daughter, Zlachika, lay in a hospital bed in Kežmarok, struggling for breath against the grip of pneumonia. The maternal instinct overrode all caution. Irena had to return to the east. She had to be with her sick child, and she needed to prepare her home for the new life growing inside her. She packed her meager belongings, her heart racing faster than the chugging engines of the few trains still running. She did not know it then, but this journey, intended to be a reunion, was the prologue to an odyssey of suffering that would span 8 endless years. She was stepping out of a difficult present into a future defined by the brutal machinery of Joseph Stalin's Bolshevik regime. Irena was destined to become one of 10,000 innocent souls from Slovakia, swept up in a tide of geopolitical paranoia and cruelty. Her journey began with deceptive promise. The train carried her as far as Ruzhambarok, the wheels clacking a rhythm of urgency. But there the tracks ended, severed by sabotage or bombing, the iron veins of the country broken. To go further east, towards the front lines and home, one had to rely on feet, carts, or sheer fortune. Irena found a stroke of luck in the form of a German military vehicle, a Gazik. The crew, seeing a pregnant woman in distress, offered her passage to Liptovský Mikuláš. It was an act of mercy in a merciless time, but it brought her to the razor's edge of the war, the front line itself. Liptovský Mikuláš was a cacophony of artillery and anxiety, but Irena's resolve was iron. She crossed the front line on foot, a solitary figure navigating a landscape of craters and soldiers, driven by the image of little Zlachika, feverish in a hospital bed. Miraculously she succeeded. She slipped through the net of combat and found her way to the liberated town of Poprad. Standing there, she could see the silhouette of the high Tatras piercing the sky, the mountains that watched over her home. She was only 15 kilometers from Kežmarok, 15 kilometers from Zlachika. She allowed herself a moment of relief. It seemed she had won. But victory was a mirage. In the shadow of those majestic peaks, the hand of the Soviet secret police, the dreaded NKVD, fell upon her. They did not see a frightened mother rushing to a sick child. They saw a suspect. Her crime was one of association and geography. Irena was the wife of Ferdinand Kawash, a master wheelwright and a Carpathian German. His workshop was prosperous and modern, known for producing high-quality skis, a symbol of a life that was comfortable and integrated. But to the Soviets, his German ethnicity and their prosperity were indictments. Irena was seized on the street, the shock of the arrest stealing the breath from her lungs. When she was dragged before the interrogators, she pleaded with frantic desperation. She pointed to her distended abdomen, the undeniable proof of her condition. She cried, "I am just going home to give birth. My daughter is sick. I am not a spy." The NKVD officers, men with eyes hardened by years of blood and ideology, merely sneered. They looked at her pregnancy not as a reason for mercy, but as a tactic. Camouflage, they mocked.
To them, the life inside her was nothing more than a prop used by a spy to evade detection. The absurdity of the accusation was matched only by the speed of the sentencing. There was no trial, no defense, only the slam of a gavel in a kangaroo court. She was sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment.
Almost immediately, Irena was swallowed by the deportations. She was herded onto a train, not a passenger car this time, but a cattle wagon reeking of fear and unwashed bodies. She was now just another number, another body to be fed into the insatiable gulags of the Soviet Union. As the train lurched forward, beginning its agonizing crawl toward the east, a collective desperation took hold of the prisoners. They knew they were vanishing from the known world. In the dim light of the swaying wagon, hands scrambled for scraps of paper. Pencils were passed around like precious artifacts. Irena, tears streaming down her face, wrote a hasty message. She scribbled an address and a few heart-wrenching words, a plea to let her family know she had been taken. Through the wooden slots of the wagon, she watched the Slovak countryside roll by for the last time. With a prayer, she threw the crumpled note out into the wind, watching it tumble into the grass. Fate, in a rare moment of kindness, guided that piece of paper. Somewhere in Poland, an unknown stranger found the note. Perhaps moved by the handwriting or the obvious desperation of a message thrown from a prisoner transport, this anonymous soul ensured it reached its destination. Weeks later, Irena's brother-in-law opened his mailbox to find the last physical trace of her. He read the words with horror. For years to come, he would be the anchor of her memory, writing endlessly to authorities, begging for information, refusing to let her ghost fade, even when the rest of the family began to lose hope. He was the last relative who dared to believe she was still alive. But belief could not save Irena from the reality of the transport. The journey to the Far East took 3 hellish months. The cattle cars were incubators of misery. There was no sanitation, no heat, and barely enough food to keep a rat alive, let alone a human. The cold seeped through the wooden planks, biting into the marrow of the prisoners. Thirst was a constant, maddening companion. Disease moved through the crowded space, claiming the weak. Irena's son, Jan Antal, who would later recount her story based on her fragmented, painful memories, described the horror. Mom said that on the train, everyone was constantly tormented by cold, hunger, thirst, and disease. When someone died, the others would divide their things to get at least a little warm. They never got to go outside for fresh air in the sun for the entire time. In this rolling coffin, Irena suffered a loss that would haunt her forever. The stress, the malnutrition, and the physical trauma were too much for her pregnancy. There were no doctors, no midwives, only the sympathetic but helpless hands of fellow prisoners. In the filth and darkness of the cattle car, she miscarried. The child she had fought to protect, the camouflage the NKVD had mocked, died before it ever saw the light. There was no burial, no ceremony, only the rhythmic clattering of the wheels and the silence of a mother's broken heart. Irena was assigned to the gold mines. It was work that broke strong men, and it was devastating for the women. Every morning they were marched out to the dig sites. The convicts dug holes in the frozen-through ground with primitive tools so that the guards had a place to put the explosives, John Antal later explained. After the blast, the prisoners sorted the rock in the cold and looked for the precious metal in it. The quota was the god of the camp. Every prisoner had to hand over at least 2 grams of gold a day. It sounded like a small amount, but extracting it from the stubborn, frozen earth required a caloric expenditure they could not afford. Those who failed to meet the quota were punished with food deprivation. Their already pitiful ration, a bowl of flour porridge greased with tallow or salted pieces of fish, was cut. It was a death sentence by degrees.
The hunger was so terrible that people would even go and collect garbage just to fill their stomachs a little, John recounted. Memories of food became hallucinations. Irena told her son of a moment that stood out in the gray haze of those years. A friend managed to smuggle her 2 sugar cubes. She held them on her tongue, the sweetness exploding like a supernova, a fleeting reminder of a world where pleasure existed. She remembered those sugar cubes the way children remember the magic of Christmas. Survival required cunning and solidarity. In rare moments, the earth yielded more than the quota demanded. Every now and then, someone managed to find a little more gold, and they would immediately hide a part of it to have something to hand over the next day, John said. This hoard was their insurance against a bad day, a way to keep the starvation rations from being cut further. Those who were not lucky or not careful vanished. The permafrost was too hard to dig graves in. The bodies were simply covered with snow and rocks, forgotten by the state, but mourned in silence by those who remained. Death brushed against Irena many times, but one incident paradoxically saved her life. While working, a heavy container filled with sand broke loose and crashed down onto her head. The impact was crushing. She collapsed, blood staining the snow. For days she hovered between life and death, but she survived, and the severe injury meant she could no longer work in the mines. She was transferred to lighter duties, first to the laundry, washing the lice-ridden rags of the camp, and later to the infirmary. The infirmary was a place of misery, lacking medicine or equipment, where she could offer little more than water and comfort to the dying. But it was indoors. Eventually, she was moved to the kitchen. This was the turning point. Her condition improved there because she sometimes got at least slightly better and more nutritious food, John noted. The proximity to food meant the difference between slow starvation and survival. It was during this time, around the 5th year of her imprisonment, that Irena found herself in a complex situation common to the Gulag. She began a relationship with one of the guards. Historians note that for many female prisoners, these relationships were survival strategies, a way to gain protection, a warm coat, or an extra piece of bread. Irena never spoke of the emotional nature of this bond, only the outcome. She became pregnant again. On February 24, 1950, in the bleak surroundings of the Elgin camp, life asserted itself against the odds. Irena gave birth to a son. She named him John. The identity of the father remained a mystery that John would carry his whole life. I never managed to find out who my father is. I don't know if it was one of the prisoners or that guard, John admitted, his voice thick with emotion decades later. Mom only told me that he was a good man, and when he could, he brought her something to eat. The joy of birth was immediately tempered by the harsh reality of their existence. John was born premature, weighing a fragile 820 grams, less than a bag of sugar. Irena, her body depleted by 5 years of hard labor and malnutrition, had no milk. She watched her tiny son whimper with hunger, helplessness washing over her. The Elgin camp authorities, in a rare pragmatic decision, allowed the baby to be taken to a nearby settlement where a wet nurse was found. Irena was separated from her child once again. Having lost her first pregnancy in the cattle car, this separation was a fresh torture. She was allowed to visit John only once a month, and even this was not a right, but a reward. It was granted only if the camp management deemed her work and conduct exemplary. To see her son, she had to walk 17 kilometers through the taiga. Those walks were epics of maternal devotion. Irena trudged through deep snow, the silence of the forest broken only by the crunch of her boots and the howling wind.
She risked hypothermia with every step. On one journey, the cold nearly claimed her. She stumbled into the settlement more dead than alive. On another, she froze in her tracks at the sight of a bear, its breath steaming in the air, before it turned and lumbered away. She braved the wilderness for a few precious hours of holding her son, memorizing his face before the long walk back to the barbed wire. As time passed, the bond between the wet nurse and the boy grew. The woman offered to adopt John, to give him a permanent home in the settlement, so Irena could have him nearby without the monthly trek. It was a kind offer, but Irena refused. "Mom couldn't imagine giving me up," John said. She had lost everything else: her home, her husband, her freedom, her first pregnancy. She would not sign away her son. But the state had other plans. When John turned 3, the regulations regarding children born in the Gulag came into effect. They were property of the state, to be raised in institutions. John was taken from the settlement and placed in an orphanage in Vladivostok. Later, he was moved thousands of kilometers west to Moscow. He grew up in the sterile, loveless environment of the Soviet child care system, speaking Russian, knowing nothing of his Slovak heritage or the mother who had walked through blizzards to hold him. Irena was left in Elgin, bereft of news, unaware if her son was dead or alive. Change came slowly, like the breaking of spring ice. In March 1953, Joseph Stalin died. The dictator's death sent tremors through the empire he had built on fear. The political thaw began. A year later, in 1954, the gates of the camps creaked open for many who had been unjustly condemned. Irena Kawaschová received an early release. She was 46 years old, her health shattered, her youth stolen. She began the long journey back to Czechoslovakia, traveling the reverse of the path that had taken her to hell. She returned to Teplička nad Váhom, to the parents she had left 9 years prior. Standing before the familiar door, fear gripped her. She looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, gaunt, aged beyond her years, marked by Kolyma. She went to a neighbor first. "Please," she asked, "prepare my parents. Tell them I am alive. I don't want to kill them with the shock." Despite the warning, the reunion was overwhelming. When Mrs. Mayerikova saw her daughter, the girl she had mourned for nearly a decade, she collapsed to the ground in a faint. The grief and joy were too heavy to bear standing up. But the homecoming was bitter. Irena soon learned that the life she had dreamed of returning to had evaporated. Her husband, Jan Kawashik, had waited for 6 years. He had searched, inquired, and hoped, but eventually silence and time convinced him she was gone. He had her legally declared dead, remarried, and started a new family. The home in Keshmarok, the workshop, the life she had clung to during the darkest nights in the barracks, it belonged to someone else now. Irena did not collapse. She had survived the Gulag. She would survive this heartbreak. She channeled all her remaining energy into one singular goal: finding Jan. She became a fixture in government offices, filling out forms, writing letters, pleading with the Red Cross. She was a mother hunting for her cub across the vast confusion of post-war Europe. For a year there was silence. Then a breakthrough. The Red Cross located Jan in an orphanage in the Soviet Union. Arrangements were made. He was to be brought to Czechoslovakia by Russian soldiers traveling to occupied Germany. The reunion took place at a train station. Irena stood on the platform, her heart hammering against her ribs. The train hissed to a halt, and a window slid down. A soldier leaned out, holding a small boy with wide, confused eyes. He passed the child down into Irena's trembling arms. "This is your mom," he said in Russian.
Jan, 5 years old, looked at the woman weeping as she clutched him. I didn't understand it and didn't understand anything, Jan recalled vividly, but I was very glad that I suddenly had someone who was hugging, kissing, and stroking me. I had never known anything like that. In the orphanage, there was discipline and food, but no touch, no affection. He stood on the platform holding a small suitcase and a parting gift from the soldiers, a little tin wind-up airplane. I called it samolyochik, he said. I couldn't speak anything but Russian. The language barrier was immense, but the language of the embrace needed no translation. Mother and son lived for a time with their parents in Teplichka, slowly rebuilding a life from the fragments. Eventually, the authorities in Kežmarok intervened in the matter of her former husband's estate, awarding Irena half of the house that had once been hers. She moved back to the town of her arrest. She did not return to Ferdinand, but she found companionship again. She married František Vrana, a shoemaker, a gentleman who understood the need for quiet stability. He developed a loving relationship with Jan, becoming the father figure the boy had never known. And Jan, the boy from the Gulag, finally met Zlatica, the sister whose illness had sparked the tragic journey. They bonded, bridging the gap of years and trauma. As Jan grew, the shadow of his origin loomed over him. Adolescence brought questions. Who was he? Where did he come from? When the geopolitical curtain lifted enough to allow it, Jan Antal returned to the Soviet Union. He traveled back to Elgin, walking the ghostly remains of the camp looking for the echo of his mother's suffering and the mystery of his father. He captured this journey in the documentary My Father, the Gulag. Irena Kawaschová lived the rest of her life in the quiet dignity of a survivor. She never received official rehabilitation. On paper, until the day she died, she remained a convicted spy. The injustice was a stain on the state, not on her. To Jan, she was not a victim, but a titan. She remembered her as a brave, wise woman who refused to let the bitterness of the past poison his future. She raised him with the simple, powerful philosophy: live as an honest person and do not mind the circumstances. She knew better than anyone that circumstances were often beyond control. All one could control was the integrity with which one faced them. Her story and that of her son remained hidden for decades until writer Peter Juszczak unearthed it, preserving their testament to resilience in his novel And Don't Forget the Swans. Through his words and Jan's memories, Irena Kawaschová finally returned home, not just to Kežmarok, but to the collective memory of a nation.